Hey, everybody, welcome to Vice News. I'm Todd Zwillig, Deputy DC Bureau Chief. Just within the last couple of days, the purge continued. Christopher Krebs, who last week predicted that he would be fired by the president from his post as the cybersecurity chief of the Department of Homeland Security, actually was fired by the president from his post at the Department of Homeland Security. And Christopher Krebs predicted he'd be fired because he spoke out in defense of a free and fair election. He predicted that is what would get him fired by the president. Turns out Christopher Krebs was exactly right. That was just within the last couple of days. Well, early last week, that very same purge began when a deposed president, refusing to acknowledge those very same free and fair results, swung his scythe at his own national security team. First, the head of the snake, the Secretary of Defense, Mark Esper, forced out. And then after that, a series of lesser supposed snakes of the deep state. Top officials at the Pentagon, at the Department of Homeland Security, at the National Security Agency. No less than 8 or 9 NatSec officials fired or resigned in the purge so far. Now, Kayleigh McEnany, both private, concerned, totally acting privately and not on the taxpayer's dime, Republican Kayleigh McEnany, and Kayleigh McEnany, the White House press secretary working on a government paycheck, says that all of this is just the normal machinations of a normal, popular, beloved commander-in-chief confidently and resolutely steering his national security team to a second Trump term. Well, Kayleigh McEnany, like the commander-in-chief, is always honest. But some of us who are maybe less stalwart, who lack the loyalty of an acolyte or the confidence of a junior varsity authoritarian, are left to wonder and ask some questions like, what exactly is Trump up to with this purge? Already the president's newly, obviously somewhat shallower state has made moves in Afghanistan and in Iraq, is looking at Iran. But is that all? So let's answer some of these questions. Andy Weber is senior fellow at the Center for Strategic Risks. He's here with me. And so is Shane Harris, my friend who covers national security for the Washington Post. Hey guys, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
So I just kind of laid it out, maybe in snarky terms there, Andy, but the purge continues, DHS, NSA, certainly the Pentagon. We'll get into the details, but from where you sit, what's Trump up to?
Well, I served 30 years in the federal government for every president from Ronald Reagan through President Obama, and I've never seen anything like this. The answer is we don't know. The sort of more benign interpretation is this is just petty retribution against people that Donald Trump didn't like, but it has all the markings of sort of what I observed when I served overseas in banana republics. I mean, this is not something we expect from a stable, strong democracy like the United States of America.
Shane, let me get to you first with the latest news, which is Christopher Krebs. He was head of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Division at the Department of Homeland Security. I already mentioned he was fired for defending a free and fair election. He said that no votes were deleted or disappeared in this election. That got him fired. That's the latest news. What's up with Chris Krebs and what have we learned?
Well, he was really, I guess you might call him even the public face, or maybe the most prominent one of the government's efforts to secure the election. And it's important to remember that this agency, CISA, that he ran, was created after the 2016 experience as a way of securing our elections against foreign interference and disinformation in 2020. So this was essentially our government's response to what happened in 2016. Was a very visible figure. I mean, very well known to journalists, to the public, and ultimately, delivered kind of a clean bill of health not long ago where the agency said, look, this was the most secure election we've had in American history. We feel really good about it. We didn't see the kind of a scale of effort from Russia or other countries that we did before that had been so disruptive. Obviously, you could always do better, but I mean, this was like a really positive signal that the election had gone well, and that this new security apparatus that was set up in response to this previous kind of disastrous experience had worked. And as you put it, Todd, I mean, he got fired for it, for telling the truth. I mean, the president said in a tweet that he was highly misleading. He is not accounting for ballot fraud and votes being deleted, all things that didn't happen. I mean, the president's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, was in court in Pennsylvania and couldn't even come up with allegations of fraud. They aren't even alleging them in a complaint that they filed in a court there. So, this is, I mean, really kind of I think part of the president's effort to undermine confidence in the election. And I think it's very dangerous. He is poisoning, the well here and making potentially millions or hundreds of millions of people doubt the fundamental stability of our elections and our democracy. It's deeply troubling, and the firing of Chris Krebs is just another in a series of these events over the past couple of weeks.
Shane, people probably don't spend a whole lot of time on the inside minutia of the Department of Homeland Security, and that's okay. But there's a deeper story at DHS here that even predates this. I mean, if you go back even a couple of months, senators, a lot of people, I mean, there's been great reporting from your paper and elsewhere that the acting secretary of DHS, who is a Trump acolyte, Chad Wolf, and some of his deputies were responsible for essentially doctoring intelligence to service Trump's lies, to service his campaign narratives, both about Russia and the safety of the elections. I realize Chris Krebs is one person, but there's a deeper story here, and I wonder if there's not a longer arc of this story rather than the very simple one, which is Chris Krebs said free and fair election, essentially certifying it, and Donald Trump, who's lying about the election for his own purposes, had to fire him to make an example of it.
Yeah, there is a longer story here of that, and there's a kind of a pattern in practice, I think, of both borne out in reporting and by allegations from people who've worked at the department, that what leaders there have tried to do is to kind of downplay the threat of foreign election interference, and particularly to downplay Russia as the kind of unique threat that it has posed in terms of disinformation, hacking and dumping, those kinds of things. We didn't see any hacking and dumping in 2020, but this effort to kind of play them down while at the same time equating what Russia does to countries like China and Iran, which really muddied the picture. And Chad Wolf was sort of at the forefront of that. There was also a whistleblower allegation from the guy who used to run the intelligence office at the Homeland Security Department, who himself is quite a problematic figure, we should say, but who alleged that orders were coming down from the National Security Advisor to essentially tell DHS to stop reporting on Russian election interference. And they have that as a requirement. Election security falls within the DHS remit. So there has been this longer pattern of political loyalists at the agency trying not to upset the president and trying to muddy the message. And Krebs really just cut right against that. And in being truthful, was telling a story that the White House, frankly, doesn't really want to tell.
And Krebs did know, in fact, when he went out and did this, that he was trolling the president. I mean, Andy, he did know that he would get fired. He had to know that he would get fired. It's a good thing that he defended the integrity of the election. But Andy, it also occurs to me that he's now leaving with something on his resume that a lot of Trump administration officials don't get, which is a gold star that says fired by Trump for defending democracy. Not everybody gets to leave on their shield like that.
It's very rare. I mean, proximity to this president has tarnished reputations of people that I had tremendous respect for. It seems inevitable. And over time, he's surrounded himself increasingly by sycophants who won't speak the truth, just tell him what he wants to hear. And that's very dangerous. And he seems to be brooding and sulking in this very isolated bubble. And it is going to be a challenge to get through the next 60 days. There's no question about that. But Mr. Krebs certainly deserves our appreciation for the amazing job he did to secure our election.
So I want to get into some of the moves that have been made since the purge started. We'll talk about Afghanistan. We'll talk about Iran. We might even talk about corruption a little bit before this conversation is over. But let me go back to the beginning, Andy. Mark Esper, the Secretary of Defense, who's apparently been on the shit list for a long time. I will say certainly on the shit list ever since he let it be known that joining President Trump in his gas and clear operation in Lafayette Square over the summer, and photo op was a bad thing. At least in his mind, he kind of sought some absolution after that. I know the president noticed that. But winding back to last week, to the beginning of the purge, why Esper's head? Why now? What does it accomplish? What was Trump doing there when there's only 10 weeks left in his presidency?
Well, again, we don't know. There's sort of the benign interpretation that he's just seeking petty retribution against people he didn't like. And there's the malign interpretation that this is part of some plan that he has. I actually lean towards the more pathetic interpretation, that it's just kind of the last petty moves of somebody who's on the way out of power.
Shane, do you share that? I mean, in a minute, we're going to talk about some major policy moves, drawdowns in Afghanistan that are clearly policy, so more than just pettiness, probably. But in terms of Esper and his ouster, do you see pettiness? Do you see policy? Do you see a mixture? Or what do you see there?
I do think a mixture, and I think Andy's right. I mean, pettiness, I think, drives a lot of what this president does. You should never underestimate the power of grievance as a motivator for Donald Trump. It is at the core of his entire political theory. I think that in the policy case as well, you did have Esper as being someone who I think was, I don't want to say standing in the way of the president's desire to draw down troops abroad, but is seeing as, not enabling that sufficiently and kind of, being a bit of an obstacle in that regard. And now we're seeing reporting from us and from other news organizations that Trump is going to start drawing down those troops, whether that's a bit of a shell game or whether they're actually going to come home in 60 days is an open question. But I think, with Esper out of the way, he may feel emboldened to try and make good on these campaign promises that he had, as he put it, to end endless wars, to bring our forces home. And getting Esper out of the way, maybe helps him do that a bit more. But, this is a president who, with the exception of Mike Pompeo and Ben Carson, I'm kind of hard pressed to think of many cabinet secretaries who have not gone through the cycle of being in the president's good graces, and he thinks they're the most brilliant people in their field, and isn't he great for having hired them? And then they turn out to all be idiots, and they're terrible at their jobs, and he fires them. And there's this kind of ritual of, adoration and humiliation, and it's just sort of a rinse repeat cycle. And they all know it's coming. I mean, I think it's very clear Esper knew this was in the cards. So, but I think that, if we're looking for kind of trying to divine some policy motive, I think there's some evidence that it has something to do with this, with these troop levels.
It all points back. I know we talked about Krebs, but it all points back to sort of the intention that he had, not only in making good statements about defending the integrity of the American election, which appears to have been run very, very well, but also knowing that the end is coming, whether it's for being on Trump's bad side or just the end of the presidency. He knows it. And for all the other things that Krebs did, he certainly found himself an honorable, very high profile way off the ship. And most people have not managed to get anywhere close to that. So that's the insider stuff. But back on Afghanistan then, let's talk about those troop levels. So we had, correct me if I'm wrong, 4,500 US troops still in Afghanistan. I want to say 3,500 in Iraq, but I could be wrong. Both of those to be drawn down, Shane, to 2,500 under the president's plan. And you said those troops, correct me if my numbers are wrong, but you said also those troop drawdown efforts. Look, they have divided Republicans. Mitch McConnell doesn't like to criticize Trump and has said it's a terrible idea. Some Republicans are backing it up. Some are very, very against it. Some in the military brass have advised against it. So that puts a check mark in the column of, I want to draw down troops. I want out of Afghanistan, and I don't want anyone standing in my way, right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'd like to know what Andy thinks about these levels of how meaningful they are. I mean, the Iraq drawdown seems sort of like, not a significant percentage of sort of the residual force that would be left there. But I think Trump wants to be able to say, look, I did this, I'm bringing everyone home. And then he kind of punts that over to the folks at the Pentagon and the military to actually do that. And I mean, withdrawing all American troops from these two countries in 60 days, color me skeptical that happens, and all of the equipment that's there. And then there's all the questions like, are you going to leave something behind? And, how would we deal with that? So this, this may well be more about theatrics than it is about real numbers and just giving the president the chance to kind of, as you put it, check a box and say he did something. But in practical terms, it's more complicated than that.
Andy, do you agree? And if that's true, did he need to fire 9 people to effectuate this these optics for himself?
Well, he is the commander in chief, so he can, he can make orders like this that the military has to carry out. But I agree with Shane that the military will probably slow roll this, maybe withdraw personnel and then replenish them 5 or 7 days later when the Biden administration comes into office. It's done in a precipitous way, but at least in Iraq and Afghanistan, they're not going all the way down to 0, which we know that was Trump's original intent or desire to do that. So he was at least talked off the plank a little bit. So, and I don't think it will be a big crisis, but it's certainly in the middle of negotiations between the Afghan government and the Taliban. It sends all the wrong signals.
So if we jump off that plank onto another one, there was reporting within the last few days that Trump had gone to his planners and asked for options on Iran, for potentially hitting Iran before his term is over, potentially strike on Iranian nuclear facilities because Iran has amassed more nuclear fuel than they're allowed under the Iran nuclear deal, which the United States is no longer party to. We should make sure to say that. So Andy, what about Iran? You talked about talking Trump down off the plank. Where is he on the plank on this one? And can we draw connections between the purge and his making asks about a huge provocation, a military strike on Iran?
Well, first of all, it shows the utter failure of his policies vis-a-vis Iran and North Korea and their nuclear programs. And they have both, on his watch, increased their capabilities. Iran in a very minor signaling way, and I think there's still a possibility that the Biden administration can recover from that. But apparently he was exploring a military strike likely against targets associated with the Iranian, very small-scale nuclear program. And I think he was apparently talked out of that by, one of the last remaining adults in the room, General Milley. But I worry a lot in the next 60 days that the Israeli leadership may see an opportunity to strike those targets. We, during the Obama administration, spent a lot of time talking the Israeli government out of military strikes against the Iranian nuclear facilities. And they may see a brief window of opportunity to do so and have Trump look the other way or even voice verbal support. So it is going to be a pretty hairy 60 days.
Shane, do we know anything about the acolytes and officials that have been installed in the Pentagon and the national security apparatus now in these last couple of days that point to some green lighting in Iran, whether it's U.S. weapons or cyber attacks or green lighting the Israelis to do it?
Well, I don't know if we don't know yet about any kind of green light, but Chris Miller, who is running the Counterterrorism Center, has come in as the acting secretary, I guess he's the acting secretary, and a guy named Kash Patel, who is serving as his chief of staff. I would probably say these folks maybe lean more hawkish towards Iran maybe than Esper. And certainly I think that if there were an attack on U.S. forces in the Middle East or in Iraq that actually cost lives, I think you would probably see a fairly overwhelming response from the U.S. And that's something that the Iranians certainly know. We kind of did that dance some months ago after the U.S. killed the Iranian General Qasem Soleimani. And I note that there on Tuesday was a rocket attack, I think tied to Shia militias in Iraq on the Green Zone embassy compound in Baghdad. So again, kind of maybe a probing by the Iranians. I don't know that this administration, though, is sort of, hell-bent on starting a war with Iran in the waning 60 days. I think that there are people who have clearly favored a much more aggressive posture towards Iran. I would put Mike Pompeo in that category. I would put the National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien in that category of people who would like to see perhaps action taken and want to present the president with options that he has to limit the Iranian nuclear program before he leaves office. I don't know how much thought the president gives to all of this and how he sort of squares it with his desire not to get into wars, because that's sort of what you're asking for if you're talking about.
Yeah, I was gonna say to that, Shane, exactly. Like I'm the area non-expert who was surprised to read that reporting that Trump had asked for options on Iran, because I was of the naive point of view that these types of provocations and potential strikes overseas were not really his MO. Yeah, and I was surprised to read that.
Yeah, I do think from our reporting that we've done on this that I don't know if I would phrase it exactly as the president saying, give me options I want to attack, so much as maybe pushing them over to him and considering them, but ultimately in the end, backing away from it. But we should, to put that in context, right? The mere fact that they are sort of, maybe hemming and hawing or throwing ideas around about this in the last 60 days about possibly striking Iran is quite extraordinary, and it's quite troubling. And, into what Andy said, the Israelis, I think, probably have a good sense that Joe Biden, who has said he wants to look at rejoining the Iranian nuclear accord, maybe is not going to be as open potentially to them launching a military strike. So they have a closing window here as well. And, doing all of this kind of just, deeply consequential national security decision-making at a time when you're firing people by tweet and you're pushing out defense secretaries, and I'm sure the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, is feeling maybe a little bit insecure right now. This is just tremendous chaos to have at a time when you're talking about possibly bombing another country. I mean, it's just, as with so many things in this administration, it's a bit head spinning. This is not how a transition is supposed to go, to put it mildly.
Yeah, Andy, to Shane's point, how does that feel on the inside of the Pentagon to planners or people who worry about what it really takes to transfer the commander-in-chief's orders into kinetic action or into national security action, when people to the left of you, people to the right of you are dropping like flies, getting fired by tweet, getting shat on by the commander-in-chief, but it's still your job to effectuate orders. You may even agree with the policy. I mean, what does it mean, like, when it's actually your job to carry out national security orders and it's just chaos in the cubicles?
Well, I think the most worrisome aspect, and again, there's been nothing like this in my lifetime, is that our adversaries are observing this chaos, and they may want to take advantage of it. I mean, this is a time for us to show steadiness and unity. I mean, transitions are a vulnerable period, and the way it's being managed by, Nixon had the madman theory, where he felt he could act like a madman and perhaps help get his way. But maybe Trump really is a madman. That's what it appears like. Just every whim. We get whiplash just from tweet to tweet, and it's a terrible way to run the most powerful country in the world.
Andy, it occurs to me, I didn't invent this idea, but Trump is also a person who has already proven that he likes to make life difficult for Joe Biden, who beat him in the election. I have no idea if they would do it or try to get the Israelis to do it, but it seems to me that hitting Iran over the head right now would change the facts on the ground and make it harder for Joe Biden to rejoin the Iran nuclear deal, even if he wanted to.
Yeah, well, the American people have spoken. We've selected a new leadership. Indeed, we're yearning for that steady hand on the tiller. So it would be very, very disturbing if Trump were to use this, on his way out the door to lash out in a provocative way that could have enormous ripple effects and actually could escalate quickly into a regional war.
Shane, if that's the case, and I realize we're veering into speculation, so you'll only do as much of this as you want to, but if it is true, I mean, it is true, I will stipulate that it's true that Trump would love to mess things up for Joe Biden and make his life difficult in general. He's proven that. If it's true that striking Iran or even a cyber attack on Iran, making Iran unhappy and inconveniencing them now would make it harder for Joe Biden to restart the U.S. role in the Iran nuclear deal. Does Iran know this? Does Iran take into account who Donald Trump is? Can they hunker down and say, we can absorb this because we know we're getting a more amenable commander-in-chief in Biden, and let's not respond, let's not let a provocation push things to a breaking point in the Gulf, and even if Trump does something to provoke us, we'll wait it out? Do you think they have a mindset like that?
Well, I think it's hard to know, and even for our intelligence community, what's going on in the minds of Iranian leadership. But just, I guess, thinking it out kind of just rationally, that they know that a Biden administration may mean bringing America back into the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement. And what they really want is an end to sanctions, right? I mean, they want to have the sort of the yoke lifted off of their economy. They want to be able to trade oil, at least legally and more freely. And so they're going to be looking for those kinds of incentives. Now, this does not mean that the Biden administration comes in, to be clear, approaching Iran in any way like an ally or remotely treating them as a good actor. They're not in the region, and they still are our adversary. And I imagine that, President-elect Biden is probably already thinking through the ways that if they do come back into the nuclear deal, what do we want out of it? And what might we change about it? A lot is going to depend on, frankly, what the intelligence is on Iran right now, which he does not, because Biden doesn't have access to because he's not being briefed on it. But by and large, sure, I suppose the Iranians understand that they're going to have, at least somebody who is a more rational actor who is willing to negotiate with them in ways that the Trump administration, simply was not.
Todd,
Go ahead,
can I just add?
Yeah.
My concern is to add to your answer to your question. My concern is miscalculation. I mean, how can the Iranians understand what's going on here in Washington if we as insiders don't even understand what's going on? And that is a recipe for miscalculation.
It's a good point. I mean, we're sitting here, the three of us, in addition to a lot of people who know a lot more than me, wondering what the real motivations here are. How would the Iranians know? I think that's a great point. Shane, you just mentioned the fact that Joe Biden isn't getting national security briefings, one of the basic functions of a new commander-in-chief getting up to speed during a transition where the loser in the election isn't trying to steal the election and undermine Americans' faith in it. But that's not the situation that we're in. And I noticed yesterday in Delaware at the Wilmington Transition HQ of President-elect Biden that he got a security briefing. Right. He got a security briefing, not the security briefing. In other words, they did sort of a national security briefing pantomime with him, and it was not the president's daily brief. It was not the highly classified briefing that he should be getting, that he would be getting under normal circumstances.
Right, and they weren't even government officials. I mean, they were their
right.
former officials, many of whom are advising him, and a fair number who I suspect will be serving in his administration, which I'm sure was no doubt helpful for him, but also is a way of setting a tone that the administration wants to start thinking about all the big challenges that await them in 60 days, and a way for the president-elect to say, oh, and by the way, I'm not getting the classified information that underlies all these problem areas. I mean, at a high kind of, non-classified level, it's not, I guess, a huge problem that, the president-elect isn't getting, the president's daily briefing, if it's just kind of giving him, situation reports that he might be able to get from experts and from, frankly, from the news media. It's the classified stuff underneath it that he needs to understand. Where is Iran and its nuclear program? What are our covert capabilities in the region? What are active programs that we have going on? What do we really know about North Korea and ICBM capability? What is the status of cyber operations that we may have going on in Iran? That's the kind of stuff that you really would prefer not to be hearing about when you show up for work on January 20th, the first day. And what the Trump administration is forcing, the president-elect to do is kind of get up to running speed, from a stop on January 20th. That's dangerous. We should just underscore that. The reasons that previous administrations, including President Obama and President George W. Bush before him, have put such an emphasis on this transition, it's in large part, to an understanding, frankly, born out of the transition before 9/11, that you can't just expect the national security apparatus to just come in and be behind the curve like that, that there are real world consequences to this. And that the transition, it's not about being simply decorous or being nice or being a good loser. It's about the proper functioning of the national security apparatus. And how, as president, is that not important to you? It's another kind of baffling aspect of this, nutty transition that we're in the middle of.
All right, guys. Well, we've talked about a couple of the policy areas, hotspots around the world that are real world concerns. Iran, Afghanistan, North Korea, the former vice president, the president-elect getting briefed, all these things that could play into the purge. I want to talk a little bit about money as a possible motivator here. And without alleging corruption, where I don't know that it exists, we should point out that there is also, Andy, a pending $23 billion weapons sale to the United Arab Emirates. It's been controversial. It involves F-35s. It's not the only weapons sale to the Middle East that's been controversial in this administration, in this recent administration. And people look at that deal pending, and they look at the purge in the policy offices of the Pentagon, and they wonder if there's not a connection.
Well, I don't know that there is. I don't know that there isn't, but certainly there's a sense that they're going to do what they can do in the remaining time they have. And if this is a priority for them, they'll try to jam it through.
Shane, what about you? Any thoughts there, or any place where we should be looking as the president cleans house in the Pentagon and elsewhere, while these multi-billion-dollar deals that has always said he's a huge fan of are pending on the ledger?
Yeah, and where does Congress weigh in on that as well? I think that's an important question to ask. And reminding ourselves as well that, when the Saudis were implicated in the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, my colleague at the Washington Post, the president very explicitly said, we're not going to sacrifice weapons sales to Saudi Arabia over the death of a journalist. So that's the kind of backdrop for all of this. I think the other place where we should be looking, frankly, for money is in the campaign donations that the president is, ostensibly soliciting as part of his legal defense fund for challenging results of, obviously fair and lawful elections in the states, a large chunk of which, according to reporting, is going into political committees that he runs, into the RNC. And so, there is a real aspect of this, of the president sort of fundraising for whatever his future endeavor is, off of this just groundless allegation of voter fraud, which provides an incentive for him, frankly, to keep the act going.
Certainly in the political realm, it does. And when you look at the Pentagon, people look at weapons sales. My ears went up when I read about Revita Networks just a couple of weeks ago, which is an Irish-led telecom company. Reporting suggested that the White House was leaning on the Pentagon, Shane, to do a no-bid contract so that this company could run a 5G network on spectrum that the Pentagon owns. It sounds boring, but it's like $5 or $6 billion at stake. Again, without alleging any specific corruption, it is true that there are contracts at stake. It is true that people allege that the White House wants the Pentagon to award these contracts in a fast-track way. And people then start to wonder what Trump is up to when he cleans house and has 9 weeks left to go.
Right, and we've seen the White House, weigh in on big Defense Department procurement decisions before that should be left to professional procurement and acquisition staff in that department, precisely so that you don't create any question about whether or not political influence is being brought to bear on how we spend millions and potentially billions of dollars in taxpayer money. That's never really been a concern to this White House. So, I think, on the question of the ones that you're raising, Todd, I think you have to regard everything that they do as skeptical to suspicious on the way out the door, because there's every reason, again, we're not alleging corruption, but to be worried that what he's trying to do is sort of settle accounts on the way out. We haven't even talked about pardons. That's another discussion too. But there's sort of a sense of house cleaning and and rebalancing the ledger as we go here, which, by the way, strikes me as another indication that the president knows full well that he's not going to be president on January 20th, that he wouldn't be behaving this way if he thought that he had 4 more years.
And that very fact brings me to a basic sort of conclusion here, Andy, which is, that's true. The president knows he's not going to be president still, after noontime on January 20th. And that means that whatever his motivations are here with this purge across DHS, the Pentagon, we haven't even talked about NSA. Let's talk about that for a second. Whatever his motivations are, they're not in the public interest. They're clearly, at least as he views them, in his interest. Or else why would he be doing them with 9 weeks left to go in his term?
Yeah, so you have to wonder, where are people like Senator Mitch McConnell who understand the seriousness of, for example, GSA not signing the ascertainment memo that would allow the transition to begin officially. The stakes are very high here, and you can do a lot of damage in 60 days. I've always felt that, the day after the election, Trump would, in order to maintain his lavish lifestyle and to have these, adulation of big rallies, would, really start his 2024 presidential campaign. And I think he's bilking his supporters as we speak, using these charges of election fraud as a way to motivate them to give him more money and support this effort that will continue.
Look, I promised to bring up the NSA because one of the people who was replaced, kind of low key, and not a lot of people notice that the general counsel of the National Security Agency, right, Shane, was replaced.
Right.
Sometimes stories about the NSA kind of float by, not a whole lot of reporting on them. What do we know about that? Is it significant, or is it just a favor to somebody?
Well, I think it's both, to be honest. This is a position that usually goes to someone with, many years of legal experience at least, and preferably with real experience in the intelligence community, and particularly in NSA, where their activity is governed by extremely complex statutes that govern particularly what the agency can do with regards to Americans and U.S. persons and their data. And we think back to the Edward Snowden revelations from some years ago. We know that the sort of gargantuan amount of information that this agency collects and has to deal with. So the general counsel has to kind of sit atop all of that and help ensure, along with a lot of other lawyers, that the agency is following the law and proper procedures. That's why it goes to an experienced lawyer. It really hasn't in this case. It's gone yet again to another political loyalist, a guy named Michael Ellis, who I think only graduated law school 9 years ago, which is to say nothing of his intelligence. He may be a deeply capable lawyer, but he is not the kind of experienced person normally tapped for this. That's also a civil service job. It's not a political position. And so what that means is there's a panel that is supposed to receive applications and vet the candidates and make recommendations, which again are usually based on length of service, experience in the relevant subject matter areas. There were a number of people who are objectively more qualified for this job than Michael Ellis, one of whom was the deputy national security advisor at the agency. So, I mean, here too, it seems like the president kind of on the way out the door doing a favor to someone who has been a political ally, has worked for him in the White House, he's worked on the Hill for Republicans, and treating this very, very important legal position at our biggest intelligence agency almost as a patronage slot.
So guys, we're going to go in a minute, but we've talked about patronage. We've talked about potential corruption. We've talked about policy. We've talked about get back and revenge. We've talked about pique and personal interest. I feel weird even saying it. I feel like we have to talk about the idea of a coup. And I bring it up because I'm comfortable saying that the president would like to have a coup if he could. He would like to be able to steal this election, to reverse the results through lawsuits or faithless electors or acolyte assembly persons in Wisconsin or Michigan or judges. If he could, he would like to steal the election. He can't, but he sure would if he could. And when this purge started to happen, a lot of people who understood that idea started to say, well, holy shit, if we have a president who'd like to have a coup if he could, what does it mean to be replacing people in the national security apparatus wholesale at a time when Americans might want to be in the streets? Americans might want to be protesting an effort to steal an election or to undermine an election. So unfortunately, Andy, I think it's a question that we have to ask, entertaining the idea of a coup, and whether there's any concern when we see a national security purge that this president might be giving himself tools.
Well, even if the desire is there, we've seen demonstrated for the past 4 years a level of incompetence that's unprecedented. I mean, Mussolini, he's not. So really, I feel that it's sort of like the end of The Wizard of Oz, where you look behind the curtain and there's this small, shriveled up, shrinking presidency right now. Donald Trump's bark is much worse than his bite, and he hasn't been that effective. And even if he wanted to pull off a coup, our institutions are strong, our democracy is resilient, and he can't do it. So we have a lot to celebrate in how strong our system has been to carry us through this this trying time.
Shane, can you blame people for watching Trump's behavior in court or on Twitter or with legislators or with scams and lies about the election for wondering just what the hell he's up to when it comes to purges like this?
Yeah, no, I can't blame them, and I think it's an understandable anxiety that is born out of the great uncertainty of the past 4 years and the just bizarre, abnormal, rule-breaking behavior that the president has evinced the past 4 years. I mean, I agree with Andy that the institutions are strong. I don't know how sometimes strong the people in those institutions are, and we would like them to be stronger and stand up and pressure the president to concede. I don't worry about the lawsuits being successful. They're frivolous, frankly, and they're kind of a joke. But what I do worry about is that every day that goes by, that the president is not conceding this election and continues to claim that it was rigged, he is poisoning, the well of democracy here, frankly. And he is going to convince millions and millions of people that he is still the rightful president and that Joe Biden is not. And we are already on such a knife's edge in this country to think about the next 4 years going forward, where, huge portions of the country might believe that the rightfully installed government is illegitimate, is really scary.
It really is. And Shane, I agree with you. And I've said more than once that Joe Biden can't be birthered because he's white, but you can sure find other ways to convince huge swaths of the population that he's not really president, that he doesn't belong there, that he's illegitimate. It's a different page out of the playbook, but it's the exact same playbook. And I think it should really put people on guard and really piss them off. All right, we got to go, but I'm going to give you guys the last word on the way out. Andy Weber, the purge is on. What are you watching for? Who's next? What do you have your eye on?
Well, the CIA director, Gina Haspel, is potentially at risk, and that would be unfortunate if he fired her too. But the clock is ticking. 60 days isn't a long time. We have light at the end of the tunnel. We have the advantage of many of the people on the Biden team have only been out of government for under 4 years. So we have people who know what they're doing, who will come in and steady the ship of state right away. But they do need that support that is traditional and required during the legal transfer of power that makes our country the democracy that it is.
All right, that's Andy Weber, Senior Fellow at the Center for Strategic Risks. Andy, thanks for joining us. Shane Harris, Washington Post. You get the last word. What do you have your eye on? Is it Gina Haspel at the CIA?
Yeah, definitely Gina Haspel, and seeing how much longer she may have. But also, I'm looking very closely and trying to track on who's President-elect Biden going to pick for his cabinet? Who is he going to pick to run these agencies? Because that's going to give us a sense of the bench. He has a deep bench to draw from, but who he's going to bring forward to put in these positions. And on a hopeful note, we're learning now about these extraordinarily promising vaccines from 2 pharmaceutical companies with this astonishing 95% efficacy. The transition is not happening properly. That's depriving the incoming administration of a sense of planning and logistics. I do wonder if they, though, will simply push forward, maybe even start talking to these companies on their own and saying, look, here's how we're going to do this once we get in, so Americans can have some confidence that these, life-saving drugs are going to get to where they need to be. That seems that's job one.
What started as a story of coups, corruption, maybe, and revenge has ended on a hopeful note. Thanks to Shane Harris of the Washington Post. Shane, I appreciate it.
Sure.
Thanks so much. Andy Weber, Shane Harris, you guys are awesome. I'm Todd Zwillich with Vice News DC Bureau. Thank you for joining us, fellas. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Todd.
Thank you.